The first thing we look at is the interface and certain aspects of the interface that you'll be working with when you're dealing with audio. Now, first of all, I'll just pop this back into the standard view. So this is what you're generally looking at when you're working in Final Cut Pro. Now, you also have under Window, you have Arrange and Audio Mixing. And what that does is it gives you a few extra tools to play with. Most importantly here, the audio mixer on the top right hand side. Now I'm just going, well, I'll leave that up for the moment actually, and what you can also do is you can pull down that top panel of windows as well if you want to give yourself a little bit more room. Now first and foremost, when you're dealing with audio, this meter here is pivotal, so it's often overlooked. It's kind of showing you the levels. David, would you, either of you mind closing the windows there, please? The audio meters. What the audio meters essentially are giving you are what audio is being output from either a clip that you're previewing in the viewer or your timeline. So you have a left channel and you have a right channel. Now the audio meters are absolutely crucial for a number of reasons. First of all, they're going to allow you to objectively view the levels that all of your different clips are playing at to allow you to mix them accurately, but it's also telling you whether or not your overall mix is above or below the level that you want it to be at. Now there are some conventions that you can use when you're mixing audio, particularly digital audio. First of all, you never go to zero. If you go to zero, the two red lights will light up at the top of the meter, indicating that you have clipped audio. Digital audio cannot go above zero without distorting, and if it consistently goes above zero, then you're going to have audio that's potentially unusable. Now there are ways of bringing down the levels on clips and in the timeline to bring it down to stop it from hitting zero, and ways of sorting out audio that just clips once for a split second. There's ways that you can fix the audio, but if your audio is consistently, if it's been recorded above 0 decibels, then it's clipped and it's of no use. So you have your left channel, you have your right channel. Now it's also worth pointing out here that the numbers here, the scale that audio is measured here, you've got 0, 6, 0, minus 6, minus 12, minus 18, and so on and so forth. This is what's called a logarithmic scale. Audio levels do not increase in a linear fashion. They increase and decrease in a logarithmic fashion, and what that means is that between 0 and minus 6 the levels are at half as loud essentially. Between minus 6 and minus 12 they're half as loud again. Minus 12 and minus 18 they're half as loud. So between 0 and 6 and between 6 and 18, for example, there's quite a significant difference between those two between 0 and 6, and between 6 and 18 there's quite a difference in terms of the difference in levels. So when you get down to minus 18, minus 24, minus 30, it's significantly quieter than if you're up in the kind of 0 to minus 12 range. Now audio, the final mixed audio should generally be tipping in and around the minus 6 to minus 3 area. So if you've got good strong levels, then you should be around minus 6 to minus 3, but not going any higher than that because you'll be in danger of clipping. Individual clips representing different types of sounds can then be given kind of a starting point level when you're putting them into the mix. For instance, you will have your principal audio. Now here, the principal audio for this section is the person being interviewed. Okay, so that's the principal audio. You'll have things like synced audio. You'll have sounds that are matched up to the airplanes, for example. You'll have the natural ambient sound from the area. These are kind of secondary sounds. Then you may have music. So that would be kind of third down the list in terms of where the levels need to be. So a kind of a rule of thumb that you can use as a starting point is that your main audio is generally at minus 12 decibels. So if I load this up and play this particular piece of audio, you'll see that it's kind of tipping around minus 12 for the most part. Now it does go up to minus 6 in places there. You could sort that out if you needed to. The music is generally, while you have principal audio playing, it's going to be at around minus 18. So if I load that up, you'll see that that's playing at a lower level. And when they play together, because of the additive nature of sound, where sound waves will add together to make a louder sound essentially, you see that the total mix, let's go back down there, is up at around the -6 to -3. It's not quite there, but up there. So you see it's peaking at roughly -6 to -3 there in the total mix, whereas the principal audio has been added to the timeline at around -12. Okay? So that's the first thing that you need to kind of consider, is that all of these different types of audio in the mix are going to have different levels associated with them, and there's kind of a hierarchy of importance given to them. Now the next thing that you'll want to do when you're adding audio to the timeline is to create some sort of an order for these on the timeline itself. Now you have a number of tracks. You've got 99 audio tracks available to you. You'll rarely use the 99 tracks, but what you'll find is that you're bringing in audio with 2 channels. So you're going to have tracks 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6 with certain types of audio on them. Now a good practice is to always have that particular type of audio together on one track. So in this case, the principal audio, or the audio that comes in with the interviewer, the interviewees here, is on track 1 and 2. And if I was to have more interviews further on down the line, I would also keep those always on track 1 and 2. I'll keep my synced sounds or my atmospheric sounds always on 3 and 4. And I'll keep my music always on 5 or 6. Now the actual tracks that you leave them on is arbitrary, but the important thing here is that you keep them all on the same track. Now the reason for this is that at some point in your mix you're going to want to switch off the music. You're going to want to say, okay, well, I like this music track, but now I've got a music track on a different, or a song on a different set of tracks that I want to preview. So what you might do is switch off your music by just muting that track. Now if you had your music all on different tracks, you'd have to go all to these various clips and start bringing the volume down just to get rid of them in the mix while you listen to some more music, or even to listen to your mix without the music. So if you have all of the music on tracks 5 and 6, for example, then you can switch off 5 and 6, get rid of the music in the mix, and then perhaps try out some different music on a different set of tracks. You might want to switch off the atmospheric sound similarly, so you'll switch off 3 and 4. So keeping them all on the same track gives you the flexibility to switch things off and move between alternative clips easily. Okay, so in an organizational sense, that's sometimes referred to as checkerboarding your audio tracks. Now, that is essentially the different types of audio levels and organizing them on the timeline. Now, just look at a few different elements here on the timeline itself. By default, you won't see these little audio switches here until you click the little audio icon there down at the bottom. Now what that gives you, it gives you a mute and a solo button. Now just to point out the difference between using this button, the audible button, and the mute button. Now what the audible button does is it actually switches off all of the audio and deletes the render files. If you were to export this video clip after clicking that button, this audio would not be exported. If you were mastering to tape, you would not hear that audio. The audio is essentially gone until you switch it back on again. You will also need to re-render any clips when you switch those audio clips back on. By muting a track, you're making it quiet. It can't be heard, but it's still active. It's still there. So if you exported this or sent this to tape with it muted, it would still send it out with that audio. When you unmute it, you don't have to re-render anything. You don't have to do anything at all. Okay, so muting is preferable when you just want to quickly switch off the audio on a particular track and then switch it back on again. Soloing a track will mute all of the other tracks apart from the ones that are currently soloed. So this is something you're probably familiar with from Pro Tools or any other kind of application that deals with audio. You can solo multiple tracks or you can solo just one track. And when you unsolo it, all of the other tracks become unmuted. The clips themselves can be viewed as waveforms by going down to the little arrow down at the bottom here and selecting show audio waveforms. You can also show audio clip names. If you have a lot of clips and it's getting a little bit confusing, you can get the clip names in there as well. Okay, so what I'm going to go through first is just isolating a piece of audio on a clip that I want to take down onto a timeline. So I'm going to focus on this clip here with the guy talking. So the audio that I'm interested in is
when we get a perfect show off, you have this feeling inside of great satisfaction.
So it starts with when we get. Okay, so I'm going to go back out into my browser here, select this clip, isolate that piece of audio. I'll just show you the steps that you can take to get that down smoothly onto the timeline without any pieces of audio in it that you don't want. So this is RB interview 1. I'll load that up in the viewer. So I'll just clear the in and the out, Alt X, and take it from scratch. So the audio starts with is when we get. So what I would do is I would start off looking at the image with the audio, so you can see the lips moving, you can see them talking, and you can isolate the start of the sentence very quickly using your ears and your eyes. So when. So I can drop the playhead there and go into the audio waveform section. So now I've isolated that point there. I can put an in point because I know that's when my audio is going to start, or I could drag the in point back a little bit further and zoom in a little bit. Now I'm going to start using the waveform to actually start visualizing the word in terms of its wave, so that I can easily, or not easily, but I can accurately isolate the word when. So you can see that little lump there corresponds with the word when. So that's where I would say, okay, well, this is where I want the audio part of the clip to start. So what I can do now is I can actually make it so that the audio fades up to that point when, whereas the visuals will come in from just before that. So if I wanted to, I could put a marker there just to mark the point. Tap M to get yourself a marker. Now, in the audio section of the viewer, I have a couple of different graphs that I can play around with. Now the pink horizontal line here represents the level. So we have the level and we have the panning. So the level is just how loud it is. The panning is whether it's panned left or right. It's the panoramic nature of the sound. Now this is a stereo clip, so I don't need to worry too much about the panoramic aspect of this because it's already been recorded in a panoramic sense. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play around with the level. Now first of all, I'll play the audio to see if it's at the right level. So it's just peaking at 12, so I might just take it up 1 or 2 so that it's hitting that 12 more consistently. Okay, so the level is fine. Now what I want to do is I want to keyframe it so that the levels change so that it fades up to the word when. Now the way I can do this is in a few different ways. Now the first way that I'll show you is just to use the pen tool and to create keyframes on this graph. Now the pen tool is gotten through tapping P. You'll see the little pen icon, and I can drop a keyframe there saying this is the start of the word when. Put another keyframe here and pull that down. Now the reason being that I don't want to get a hard entry into that word when. I want it to slowly, well not slowly, I want it to fade up to the word when, so it'll soften the transition into my audio part of my clip. So now I've isolated the word when. I'll go to the end of the section that I want and I'll do the same in reverse essentially. Now this is going to be tricky. Because he says great satisfaction and he runs the two words into each other, then you have to be very precise with this particular section. So I'll find that word using the waveform. Now that seems to be the end of the word satisfaction, so I'll put keyframe there, and pull that down. Okay, so that doesn't look too bad now. I can play through. I'll put an out point actually there.
When we get a perfect show off, you have this feeling inside of great satisfaction.
Okay, so that's good to go. Now if I wanted to, I could just drag the whole lot down onto the timeline. Now we've been using 3-point editing up until now, so you should be familiar at this stage with the idea of connecting your inputs or your source clips from the browser to the actual tracks themselves. So at the moment, if you look carefully here, you'll see that the destination and the source are not connected. So if I wanted to do an edit here where I drag my clip down onto the timeline, actually I'll just move the playhead out here. You'll see that it just brings down the video, doesn't bring down any audio. And you'll see that it dropped the video up there on track 3 as well, because track 3 is connected. So watch out for that when you're working with the audio. First of all, drop the video where you need it to be. Now this is quite important because first of all it needs to be connected, but because you're going to be checkerboarding your audio and you're going to have your clips on different tracks, then it's going to be quite common practice for you to want to set a destination. In this case it is going to be 1 or 2, but if for example I wanted my source tracks from my clip in the browser to come down to 3 and 4, I'd need to reconnect those 2 sources to their destinations down there. So now when I drag that in and do an overwrite, you'll see that it brings it in and drops the audio onto the exact track that I wanted it to. Okay, so I've added a clip to the timeline, I've isolated the audio that I wanted, and I've made sure that the levels are okay. Now the next one that I'm going to do is this clip here. Or be stall and loop. Okay. Now I'll just play that clip. So the audio for this particular clip was unusable because the guy was shouting over it. So what was done here was that some sound effects or some atmospheric sounds from the day were used instead. In fact, it's just an airplane, sound effects in this case. Sound effect. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to bring down the video from the stall and loop clip. I'm not going to bring down any audio, so the way that I'll do that is I'll disconnect my source and my destination on the audio tracks. I'm just going to move this. Actually, I'll leave that for the moment. And I'll bring that down to just a place further down the timeline. Okay, so now I've got my audio disconnected, my video on track 1, and I'll overwrite that there. So that's how I would bring down the video on its own. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in that audio track, the airplane sound effects track. So I'll set the tracks that I want it to go into. I'll keep this consistent. I'll put this on tracks 3 and 4. Now this audio here should be up on track 1 and 2, but I'm just going to leave it there for the moment. I'll show you how you can disconnect those in a minute and move the audio around freely, but just for the minute I'm going to bring in that stall and loop. Now did I bring in the wrong? Yeah. Sorry, it should have been this one I brought in. Now when you're dragging something down from the audio section of the viewer, you use that little hand icon there. So if I want to drag something across to do an overwrite, for example, I can do that. Let's pull that back in. Now this audio has been recorded and brought into Final Cut Pro as a set of stereo tracks, or stereo channels rather. Now you have the option in Final Cut Pro to deal with your audio in two ways. You can leave it, if it's a stereo file, you can leave it as a stereo file, or you can take in two separate mono files, or if you want, after the fact, you can turn a stereo file into a set of dual mono channels. Now the way that you do that is by selecting the track down in the timeline. Now you'll notice when you open it up here, it opens up stereo A1 and A2. Okay, so this is a stereo file. Now stereo files are generally created either with a stereo microphone out in the field where it's able to accurately record panoramic sounds. Another way of putting it is that it has a kind of an inherent left and rightness to it. It's a stereo file. So when I open that up in Final Cut Pro, it's going to present it just as that set of stereo channels. Now dual mono is slightly different. In Final Cut Pro, when you turn something into a dual mono file, you're able to isolate each of those channels and play around with them individually more than you can with stereo. Now if you have a stereo file and you want to turn it into dual mono, this is how you do it. So you'll know it's a stereo file because it has those arrows pointing up and down on the clips. If you want to change that, you hit Alt and L, or is it Alt or L? Yeah, Alt and L. Now you'll notice that you can select each clip individually and you can open it up in the viewer. So now if I wanted to, what I could do is I could get that clip, and instead of adjusting the levels this time, what I can do is I can change the panning. So the panning at the moment is panned all the way to the left, and you'll see that when I pull it into the center, the purple bar comes up from the bottom. So it goes from -1 to 1 through 0, which is panned to the center. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, right, I'm going to let this play for a few seconds, and then I'm going to pan it all the way to the right hand side. So I'll get my pen tool and pull that up like that. Now you may not be able to hear it too clearly because of where the speakers are positioned here. But if I mute this track, for example, you should get a sense of it moving from one side to the other. So I'm going to create the illusion here of the airplane's kind of moving around the person recording the audio. Now if I wanted to, then I could simply delete this one and copy and paste. Oops. So that now I have two mono files essentially doing the same thing. Giving the illusion of stereo. Okay, so you have stereo files that are kind of already giving a left and a right panoramic sound, but then you can break those apart and create your own kind of stereo effects using the panning controls in the viewer. Now audio clips are also, when you take them in with a video clip, they are linked to that video clip. Now there's a few ways that you can link and unlink when it comes to audio. First of all, you can unlink the audio from the video, and that's done by hitting Command and L. And when you do that, you'll see the little white line disappear from underneath the name on the video clip, and then you can just select the stereo. Now you could go further then and break that apart into two mono files or channels if that's what you wanted as well. Now if after the fact you wanted to relink these two files so that you could move them around together and edit them without having to go back and drag each individual clip around, then you just hit your Command and L. Okay, now what I looked at there a moment ago is a way of fading up and down the audio by adjusting and keyframing the levels. Now this is the method that you will use when you've got a clip that you know definitely that there's a piece of audio that you need to isolate. In this case it's a sentence. That's not really going to change. I needed to get rid of the unwanted sounds around that sentence. This is a very exact and precise way of doing it. I mean, you can get in really, really close to these waveforms, depending on how much accuracy that you need. Now, on the other hand, there's other ways of fading up and down audio on the timeline, and which would be more applicable, for instance, to mixing music. So let's say for this particular track, I had music that played out louder at the start because my principal audio hadn't really come in yet. So at the start of this clip, we have music and sound effects. Then the music comes down to accommodate the speaker's voice. Now, the way that I would approach this, rather than going up and down the timeline and moving keyframes around, what I would do is I would use the blade tool and the audio transitions. Now, I'll show you the reason for this now. Let's say at this point here, I want the audio to fade down. So I'll get my blade tool, I'll blade the audio, and I can go in here to get an audio transition, crossfade, a crossfade transition, or if I have one already on the timeline, I can paste that from elsewhere down onto that edit point. So now what I have is I've got a soft transition between loud audio and quieter audio. Now, the reason I would do this instead of using the keyframes is that when you have an edit point and a transition, if your spoken piece of audio moves, for example, you can simply get your roll tool and you can roll that edit point back to where the audio is now moved to. Okay, so this is a much more fluid way of moving an edit point, as opposed to getting all of these keyframes and trying to move them all up and down the timeline. So think about it in terms of, will I potentially need to move where the audio changes here, or will I not? So music is a common reason for using this, where if a speaker comes in and moves further down the timeline, you can move the edit point with him. Okay, right. The next thing I want to show you is the audio mixer up here. Now this is giving you another way of doing something that I've already done here, and that is keyframing the levels and the panning controls of a piece of audio. Now I'm just going to drag out a piece of audio here. I get my I get the music all together. Because it's nice and long. Now, you'll see here on the timeline that you have the pink graph that's going across the center of the track. Now, if I wanted to bring the overall audio up and down here, then I could go up to this mixer and play it, and then say, okay, I want to take that down a bit. Now, you'll see that they both move because it's a stereo file. So I'll bring that down. It gets quieter. Now let's say that I want to do a kind of a dynamic audio change on this as the playhead is moving through it. What you do is you go up to the top right hand side here, you'll see the little audio keyframe button. Click that, hit the playhead, I don't know where my audio went there. But now, if I just play that back now, through recording the keyframes and adjusting the sliders here, I've actually manually placed keyframes on the track. So it's a good intuitive way of mixing the audio by using it as almost like you're at an audio desk. And you'll see that it's automatically added the keyframes. Exactly where I faded it up and faded it down. Now, one thing to look out for up on this panel here is that you don't accidentally press the master mute. This is your master section here. This will control the level of the overall mix. All tracks and all clips will be faded up or faded down if you use that master slider there. So this might be something that you use if you want to have an overall fade down with lots of different tracks at the end of a sequence, for example. If you have this clicked and if you're back in normal mode, you'll be playing away trying to listen to your audio. You'll have no idea where your audio has gone. You'll be reinstalling Final Cut Pro, trying to find out where everything went wrong, and it's often a case that you've been playing around with the audio mixing desk and you haven't unmuted the master. So that's just a tip to look out for if your audio disappears entirely in Final Cut Pro. Now on the left hand side here we have our tracks that are currently being used. So we've got 1 through 6 here because I have 6 tracks on the timeline. Now if you want to just look at tracks 1 and 2, for example, you may have again up to 99 tracks, so you can actually choose which ones you're looking at just by toggling those on and off. Okay, so hopefully that should give you enough to get working on that. It's quite simple really if you look at it, if you approach it in a kind of a step-by-step way. First of all, put the audio on the correct tracks. So match all of the different audio on tracks 1 and track 2, then have different audio on track 3 and track 4, and so on and so forth. Look at the different levels in terms of starting points. So your music is going to generally be at -18. Your main audio will be at -12, and in between there at somewhere in between there you'll have your synced audio as well. But the overall mix should generally be tipping at between -6 and -3 decibels. And if you adhere to that, your mix will be okay. Because a lot of the time the problems that you hear, or that I hear from projects coming back, is that the music is just completely dominating the scene, and it's distracting from the person's voice, or there's just some conflict in the mix where you just can't quite figure what's going on because it's just a mess. So use this as a kind of a guide. Just trying to think now. I don't think there's anything else. You can keyframe audio directly on the timeline as well. If you like to work like that, you can bring up the size of the clips by changing the clip height, and you can do that directly. And going back to the arrow tool then will allow you to move a segment in between. Now if you have completely made a mess of your audio and you want to reset the audio, then you can just double click on it, go up and hit the red X to reset the audio for that entire clip, and it will set it back to the level that it was in the original source file. If you want to adjust the levels across multiple clips, you can select those clips and you can hit Alt, Command and L, and that will allow you to do a gain adjust. Now what that gain adjust does, it allows you to either bring down the audio relative to where it was. In this case, if I go -4, it will look at all of the current levels and all of the clips that I've selected and bring them all down by -4 decibels. If you set it to absolute, then it will bring everything down to -4 decibels. Okay, so relative is generally where you want to go here. If you have lots of different clips with different levels and you want to bring down a number of those clips simultaneously without having to go into each clip doing it individually, then you would leave it at relative and just set the gain adjust relative to those particular levels.